questions and lessons from death penalty sentencing to be delivered by Dr. Anup Surennath, who is the Executive Director, Project 39A, and esteemed Professor, National Law University, Delhi. Dr. Anup has been kind enough to accept our invitation and interact with the students in the university and outside. Sir has been the Deputy Registrar Research in the Supreme Court and was on deputation to the Supreme Court from May 2014 till 2015. Uh, the Death Penalty Research Project and the resultant Death Penalty India report that I have today in my hand. This was published in February 2016. It is of immense importance. It is a very rich research. I think the first ever empirical work on the administration of death penalty in India, wherein death row convicts were interviewed from all across the India with involvement of more than 90 students in its different phases. And the findings of this report has been very important also because of the fact that this was such a rich report that it was covered by the leading national newspapers, and also it was covered internationally by the New York Times and the Guardian. And apart from many other things so good about Dr. Anup, I have to mention here that his doctoral research at the University of Oxford was supervised by Professor Sandra Friedman, and it was themed on affirmative action. So today we are here to discuss about the death penalty sentencing and the jurisprudence involving therein. Uh, I remember that Justice Bhagwati, he, while writing the dissent in Bachan Singh in 1980, he said that apart from the theoretical framework that is important and the principles that are involved in death penalty sentencing, one thing pertinent is that how do you decide on death penalty sentencing should not be consistent. And I think Dr. Anup's work, his papers, his research shows us how true was Justice Bhagwati in his dissent in 1980. So I'll not take much time. Dr. Anup, the floor is yours, and we are excited to hear you.
Right. Thank you, Swati. Thank you for having me here today, and congratulations to you and all of you for the launch of the Center for Studies in Legal Theory. We really do need more work in that field, both in terms of how we teach it, how we learn it, and also how we apply it. And in a time when so much is under challenge, we come to realize the importance of theoretical foundations, right? So thank you so much. And good to see you, Manvendra, as well. Long time. Yeah. Please feel free to switch on your videos. I really find it difficult to, even when I teach, I find it really difficult. I really try and convince my students, and I fail very often to switch the videos on. So please, if you can, that'd be good. Right. Yeah. So today is what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to present a case against the death penalty, right? What I'm going to do is assume that the death penalty exists, right, as it does, and try and talk through to you kind of difficulties that we have with sentencing, right? And I think it's one entire debate to have. Should we have the death penalty? Is it morally okay? Is it philosophically acceptable? Is it constitutional? All those are very relevant, valid, heavy questions, but that is not my concern today, right? My concern today is that assuming that we do have the death penalty as a punishment, how do we go about imposing it in individual cases, and what do we see, and what are the difficulties we see, and what does it then tell us about a broader approach to the death penalty? And I'll stop there, right? It leads us to that question, but I will stop at the gate of that question. But what I'm going to do is take you through some of the questions and lessons that arise for punishment per se in our criminal justice system, and then see where do we land up on the larger, broader questions, right? Since I'm not entirely sure what everyone's familiarity with the death penalty is, or what with criminal law is, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction, and then before I set up the questions, um, uh, of course, the death penalty as a punishment is acknowledged in the Constitution in various provisions, be it the clemency provisions or the appeals to the Supreme Court. There is a very explicit constitutional acknowledgement that the death penalty exists, and is anyway is going to one of the big questions in the constitutionality challenge anyway, that the Constitution acknowledges the existence of the death penalty, right? And of course there is Article 21. Now what the CRPC does, right, is that, and there is an evolution of the CRPC on this, as to, but particularly with murder cases, that we have gone from a position of where death was the default punishment, to now coming to the provision under the 73 code, where life imprisonment is a default punishment, and under 354(3), you have to give special reasons if you want to impose the death sentence, right? You have to give special reasons. So in that sense, life imprisonment is the default punishment, and death is the exception, and special reasons have to be given. There is a separate sentencing hearing envisaged under the CRPC, right? So that's the setup. As you're all well aware, there is then every death sentence handed out by the trial court has to be confirmed by the High Court, and then in certain circumstances there's a sort of a right to appeal to the Supreme Court in certain circumstances, and in certain other circumstances the Supreme Court can decide under its special jurisdiction to hear a death penalty appeal. Now, after Muhammad Arif, there is a mandatory open court hearing in a review petition. All other review petitions in the Supreme Court are heard in chambers, are decided by judges in chambers. Only in death sentence cases, they are heard in open court. And then you have the option of going in curative, and then there is a mercy petition that you can submit to the governor and the president. And then there is an acknowledged right under 21 and 32 to challenge the rejection of the mercy petition, right? So that's the sort of a life cycle of a death penalty case, right? And people like us, and I must put all my cards on the table here, I am not your, in all fairness, I am not your neutral academic writing on this subject, right? My research has led to me working on death penalty cases out of NLU Delhi, representing many death row prisoners. Currently, we now represent about 70% of all death sentence cases in the Supreme Court. So I don't come at this as, in that sense, you should know that I come at it from a certain angle. So please feel free to take whatever I say from that angle, right? And just a full disclosure, right? Right. So now, if this is the overall framework, there was a constitutional challenge to the death penalty in Bachchan Singh, right? And what does Bachchan Singh do? Bachchan Singh upholds the constitutionality of the death penalty 4:1, right? And an incredible trivia that you might want to know. It is very interesting that if you look at the date of Bhagwati's descent, right? It is 1982, right? It is 2 years after the majority gives its judgment in May 1980. And it is fascinating then that the majority did not read Bhagwati's dissent, or did not have access to Bhagwati's dissent when they gave the majority judgment, right? I mean, incredible, right? That Bhagwati says, I will give my reasons later in the 1981, in the 80 judgment, and comes 2 years later, right? But anyway, we won't be discussing much of Bhagwati today. The majority says the death penalty is constitutional And these are the terms on which it is constitutional. And what are the terms? A big part of that is that there has to be individualized sentencing, right? There has to be individualized sentencing, and they lay down a framework for that sentencing to happen, right? Now, I just want to pause that there and come to individualized sentencing, right? Very often, what you might hear in sort of death penalty discussions in India is that it's arbitrary, it's inconsistent, it is there's a lot of judicial subjectivity. It is like a lethal lottery. And if you haven't read that report by Amnesty International from 2006, please do read it. It's an incredible piece of research and work by Bikramjit Batra of analysis of Supreme Court judgments on the death penalty. It's called lethal lottery, right? And it's literally that, right? So you hear all of that, right? Now in terms of individualized sentencing, you might say that the best way to do away with all this arbitrariness, subjectivity, all of that, inconsistency, is to say, why don't we just have mandatory punishments, right? Why don't we say that everyone who commits theft, right, shall be imprisoned once you find that the person is guilty of theft? Why don't we say that then everybody who is found guilty of theft is sentenced to, let's say, 1 year of imprisonment or 2 years or whatever it is, right? Let's say 1.5 years, 18 months of imprisonment. We don't do that, right? And why don't we do that? Any thoughts on why don't we do that? Why can't we? What is so bad in saying that everyone who is found guilty of theft shall be imprisoned for 18 months? What is so wrong in that? That would solve all these problems of judicial subjectivity, bias, discrimination, all of that. It will solve all of that. Why? What is so bad about it? Anybody?
So the degree of the theft or like the intensity of the theft, like for example, if someone stole 100 rupees and the other one stole lakh rupees, the degree of that particular inception or that kind of thing.
Okay, so you're saying that one is the intensity that you could think that even if you categorize something as a crime, there is the intensity of the crime question. Okay, fine. Anything else?
Sir, also, what were the circumstances in which the person had to
Sorry,
commit
can you
suicide?
just identify yourselves? Aditya, go ahead.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Aditya, sir. Sir, it's. I was just saying that it also
Aditya,
we
which
have.
year are you in?
Sir, I'm first year LLM student.
Okay, go ahead, Aditya. Yeah.
So, sir, it's about the circumstances in which the person has committed that crime that has also be taken into the picture.
Why Aditya? Why is that so important? Why
Sir,
can't we say
because-
we don't care, right?
Sir, sir, we can say we don't care because everyone has to be kept on the same pedestal while catering justice. But still, there are certain circumstances or problems that might have led to such things.
Right.
There might have been a situation where someone has been kidnapped and put under a gun, and you have been asked that no, you have to get 100 rupees from there. So that could be a case as
Right.
well.
But I want you to I want to push you on that first principle question, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Even though I asked why should we care, let's just interrogate that a little more, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
What is it about individualized sentencing that is connected to the rule of law and fair trial rights? What is it? Why? If you can give me a first principles answer, right? Why should we know these circumstances, as you called it? Why should we know those circumstances? What is it? What is it leading us towards?
Sir, it would help us to know the situation more precisely, so as to help us that is 18 months is mandatory or not.
Okay. Think about it. I'm going to come
Sir-
back to you. Okay.
Sir, may I add something?
Yeah, Aditya, sure, go ahead, introduce
Aditya
yourself.
Verma. Yeah, sir.
Yeah,
Yes, sir. My name is Aditya Verma. I'm a LLM first year student, first semester
sure.
in DNLU Jabalpur.
Go ahead, Aditya.
So, sir, one aspect of why fixed sentences cannot be taken into picture is because of also the factor that we need to understand each individual differently in
Mm-hmm.
the aspects of crime. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, some are when we use the word hardened criminals or when we use a word
Mm-hmm.
like professional criminals. What do
Mm-hmm.
we mean by that? These are not the people who are forced by circumstances. These are the people who choose crime as the means of living,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when we need to have a clear differentiation between the ones who has been a victim of circumstances, on the other hand we need to address the people who make these circumstances the way they want to live.
Okay. I would still take you one step further and still ask, why is that relevant? What is that basic moral philosophical idea that lies at the foundation of what you just articulated so well? That both of you, both Aditya Tripathi and Aditya Verma, that you both articulated so well. What lies as the philosophical foundation of that?
That each individual is different, and
Theory of justice is basically.
Just a second, Aditya Tripathi. Let just Aditya Verma just answer. Yeah, go ahead, Aditya.
uh, yes, sir. Like I said, that each individual is different, and basically we cannot judge everyone in the same purview person, like I just mentioned.
Okay, right. Yeah.
So after reading your work on this the enduring the article of the endurings, so basically after that I know where we are getting towards, because all of these points somewhere you have mentioned in your article so very well,
Right.
and
No, no.
also I've highlighted those things. But
Right,
yes, I know
right.
where you are leading us to, which
Okay.
I also agree to this fact.
Okay.
Yes, no,
Yeah,
sir, I
of
would be.
course. I wasn't sure. The cat is out of the bag, right?
Yes,
But
yes, sir.
I
Basically, I
wasn't
would be
sure
seconding
how many
that.
of you have read the paper and all of that. But anyway, right. You know where I'm going.
Yes, sir.
Aditya
Also,
Tripathi.
sir,
Yes.
also I
Yes.
have also read, so I will be seconding Aditya as well. So
Right.
it basically brings us to the theories of justice. I would say that, because
Right.
how is it's being catered and at different circumstances. It's also like the punishment we get in schools. So
Right.
if you have done your homework but not got your notebook, so you are giving a minuscule punishment. Whereas if you haven't done or been through it at all, you are slapped. So
Right.
that's the difference.
Right. Yes. So, I have a great example that I use often when talking about punishment and responsibility, and I'm going to introduce those words slowly. I've introduced the word responsibility now. Who is responsible for what? What can you hold me responsible for? Right? Now, let's say that all of our law schools have terrible attendance rules, right? Mandatory attendance rules. We reward people for coming and sitting in class and don't reward them for many other things. But anyway, that's for another day. Right? Now you say, oh, your class is at 9 a.m., right? And you don't come to class, right? And are all people who don't come to class at 9 a.m. to be treated equally? Are they all equally blameworthy for not coming to class at 9 a.m.? Right? You could say, okay, I wasn't well, right? I wasn't feeling too well. I was somebody might have been going through a phase of depression. Somebody might have menstrual cramps, right? Somebody might just be going through an emotionally difficult time, right? There could be, you can think of a whole range of circumstances other than just saying, oh, that fellow or that woman is lazy, right? She was staying up till 3 a.m. watching Netflix, and that's why she can't come to class at 9 a.m. Right? Apart from that, you can think of a wide variety of reasons why that person might not be in this theory of choice, that it was not purely in that sense. I mean, we can go into the deeper philosophical debate whether anything is truly 22 carat choice. We can take up that a deep philosophical debate later. But that if you didn't come to class at 9 a.m., that is everyone to be equally held responsible for that? Is everyone equally blameworthy for that? Right? Again, I'm introducing another word here, blameworthy. right? So it is tied to philosophical notions of who can be held responsible and who is blameworthy for what. And that, yes, I might have committed an act. I might have stolen 1,000 rupees, or I might have stolen 1 lakh. But if I steal 15,000 crores, obviously I can sit happily in London, right? But right, that am I equally responsible for that as the person who stole, let's say, who stole another 1,000 rupees, right? So it is with notions of who can you hold responsible for what and to what extent that you get into this business of individualized justice. And very often in criminal law, in the sentencing stage, you have consistency and non arbitrariness pulling in one direction, and you have individualized sentencing pulling in the other direction, right? And that is the core difficulty of sentencing,
Mhm.
right? And that is the core difficulty of how to uh, guide sentencing discretion. The need for, on the one hand, consistency, non arbitrariness, non discrimination, pulling in one direction, and an equal commitment, equal philosophical commitment to individualized sentencing, pulling you in the other direction, right? And that is a deep philosophical worry that has bothered criminal law for a very, very long time, right? So that sits at the heart of the framework of within Bachchan Singh that said, yes, we are upholding the constitutional validity of the death penalty. We are holding it not to be violative of Article 21 and Article 14, but for this to continue, you have to do it under this framework. And what is the framework? Yes, they said, well, you have to identify aggravating and mitigating factors, right? And you have to weigh them, right? You have to weigh them. Again, I'm not using the word balance, right? I'm using the word weigh, right? Right? And you have to weigh them, and then you have to then it's a sort of not really sure what the court is asking judges to do, right? It is asking the judges have to do something, right? And then if the alternate punishment of life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed, right? If the alternate punishment of life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed, then you can give the death sentence, right? All wonderful things, all seem so logical. I mean, they have given an indicative list of aggravating factors, and they've given an indicative list of mitigating factors, and say, yeah, all these things are relevant. But we are not saying that only these things are relevant, and right, that's how they have asked judges to go about it. The paper, uh, yeah, and I must acknowledge at this stage when as I get into the papers, the fantastic work done by my colleagues Neetika and Preeti, and over quite a few years of work that the three of us have put into this, right? In terms of the paper seeks to challenge the argument that arbitrariness in Indian death penalty sentencing is a post Bachchan Singh problem, right? It seeks to challenge that, right? Which is what it is often characterized as, that, oh, look at what has happened to judges. It depends on which judge you go before, right? It's a lethal lottery, right? The dominant narrative in death penalty sentencing has been that the application of the rarest of rare framework has been inconsistent and arbitrary, discriminatory, whatever, right? The paper, the one in the National Law School India Review, um, uh, seeks to challenge that and makes the argument that it has that what has not been sufficiently accounted for have been the gaps within Bachchan Singh itself, right? That Bachchan Singh, in effect, is not as great a judgment as, or not as unproblematic a judgment as you might think it to be. That not sufficient attention or not sufficient critical gaze has been directed towards Bachchan Singh itself and that it is the gaps within Bachchan Singh that has in very significant measure contributed to all these problems that we have seen in the subsequent decades, now 4 decades after Bachchan Singh, right? So that's the claim of the paper, right? And the paper does a job of taking you through what are these gaps that we have identified, and I just want to spend some time on those, some more than others, and I will try to intersperse it with I was going to say interesting, but the word I guess should be tragic experiences of litigating death penalty cases, right? Right. Um, you know, I have often wondered about the ethics of academics doing this kind of um, going and representing death row prisoners kind of thing. And there is an ethical question there, undoubtedly, right? I mean, there is an ethical question there that is that what academics should be doing, right? But it's a complicated ethical question that sort of interacts with the politics of being a law teacher in the global south, right? And it's not an easy question, right? It's not an easy question, especially given the political times that we live in. These are not easy questions, but I just wanted to flag that I acknowledge it, right? That I acknowledge it, that it could be influencing the objectivity or the supposed objectivity with which I'm supposed to be writing academic pieces, right? But anyway, now, and one of the first things in the paper that we discuss that the gap within Bachchan Singh is it really doesn't tell you why mitigating circumstances are relevant, right? And that is what I just discussed. Why is individualized sentencing relevant? And why does this question become important? This question becomes important because subsequently you see benches both in in the Supreme Court and the High Court, and to a much larger extent, I mean, I don't want to say much larger extent, but equally also in the trial court, right? Judges not giving adequate weight to mitigating circumstances, right? Or even giving adequate weight to the sentencing process itself. Because I think it is not clear, this very first level question that I asked you, why should we do it? Right? Why should we do it is not clarified by Bachchan Singh, and therefore judges find it a lot easier to implement Machi Singh, right, than follow Bachchan Singh, because just as a matter of judicial process, there is something lot more concrete coming out of Machi Singh, right? And it's fascinating that if you just do a count of which gets mentioned more as precedent in sentencing judgments, it is Machi Singh, especially in trial courts, right? The study that we have done, you know, you see that the reliance on Machi Singh is a lot more, right? So the lack of this sort of normative clarity on why should a court, a sentencing court, look at mitigating circumstances, that question is relevant not just for the death penalty, but it is also relevant for all questions of punishment. And that clarity needs to come from the court, right? That clarity needs to come from the Supreme Court as to why should we care whether all people who are convicted of theft are the same or not, right? And we need that articulation to come from the court in terms of notions of responsibility and blameworthiness, right? Now, the court says that, yes, these are the conditions on which we are upholding the constitution of the death penalty, and you know, you have to bring aggravating circumstances and mitigating circumstances. Who is going to bring these, right? Right? Who is going to bring these? Two, what happens if you don't bring these, right? Are two important questions that the court does not have an answer for and has never answered in the 40 years since Bachchan Singh, right? Now, why is that relevant? Now, when Swati showed the Death Penalty India report, right? It is no secret in any retentionist country in the world, right, that the burden of the death penalty falls on the poorest, right, and the most marginalized. That's true of every country, right? The only contribution of this report is that it documents and gives you numbers rather than just go by intuition. It now gives you a solid basis to say, okay, it's now established that this is true for India also, right? Now, why is that so relevant, right? You are talking of people, and quite, if you read the report, you will see quite counterintuitively, despite being extremely poor, most people in the trial court have a private lawyer. They do not go for legal aid, right? And this is also true in our other work that we're doing in under trial prisoners in Pune and Nagpur. If given a choice, the poorest of the poor will get into debt, will sell whatever little that they have, but सरकारी वकील हमें नहीं चाहिए, कुछ भी करेंगे सरकारी वकील नहीं चाहिए, right? So they will pay whatever little they can, right, to a private lawyer who is very often fleecing them, right? And therefore, the question of quality of representation is not a quality of legal aid conversation, right? It is a more broader conversation on quality of legal representation per se, and it's not limited to legal aid. And therefore, you're talking of people now to take out mitigating circumstances in someone's life, right? And this is where I just want to draw a little more on our experience of doing these cases. Now, if somebody comes and tells you, tell me your darkest secrets, I am your lawyer, you are not going to trust that person, right? There is no reason for you to trust. First of all, you are like, if I tell this person that I raped and murdered a 2-year-old, how do I know that this person is not just going to abandon me and say, oh my God, I thought you were innocent. Bye. I don't want to do anything with you. Right? And that is the sentiment, right? Very often, it is the most difficult conversation to have with people that we represent, right? It takes hours and hours and hours of conversation to build that confidence, to build that trust, right? To assure them that you will not abandon them, that it doesn't matter to you if they have raped and murdered a 2-year-old, that you are there to give them representation, that you are still there to challenge the evidence in the case as any good defense lawyer should, right? So our practice is not just sentencing practice, right? It is very much challenging the evidence in each and every case that we do, because that's the state's job to establish that I'm guilty beyond reasonable doubt, right? It's not my job to give up my conviction case, right? Right? So there, to get those details about people's lives, what you call mitigating circumstances, if you just think about how does it translate into the realities of India's criminal justice system, of who is going to collect all of this? And lawyers are the worst in this task, right? Lawyers are just not trained to have conversations of this sort, where you need to have about 20 hours of conversation about everything else in the hope that the 15 minutes after those 20 hours will give you what you need. Lawyers are very, केस का मतलब की बात करो ना. No, what do you have to say about this evidence, right? You're very so pointed. The point I'm trying to make is a larger one, that the system needs to recognize that the expertise, while the law says mitigating factors are required, who is going to get those mitigating factors requires a high degree of expertise. It requires highly trained social workers. It requires highly trained mental health specialists, right? What are known as mitigation investigators, right? To investigate the lives of these people, not from is this person guilty, not guilty? How was this person as a child? How was this person's mother during when she was pregnant with this child, right? What is the impact of the pregnancy on the brain development of the child, right? How do they grow up into adolescence, right? As an adult, as a young adult, what is now all of this is it's very well for Bachchan Singh to say, yeah, bring mitigating circumstances. Bringing mitigating circumstances is not just saying, oh, this person is poor, this person has a family. Nobody knows why any of that is relevant, right? Nobody's so, and the court then it becomes easy for the court to say, oh, I don't care if this person was poor. Proper sentencing procedures then make that link that we started off with, that both the Adityas were talking about, that how is those circumstances relevant to your question of responsibility and blameworthiness. And nobody is trying to say that these persons must be excused or must be forgiven or they are not guilty. The question of blameworthiness is very different from the question of is this person guilty or not. You know, very often I'm asked, oh, so are you saying that they must be allowed to go free? Not all poor people rape. Not all people who were abused in their childhood commit rape on children. Of course not. Just like if I told all 38 of you here right now that you have an exam tomorrow, we all would react very differently, right? Or if I say, oh, we have a class at midnight, all of us would react very differently, right? That is because we as individuals faced with the same set of circumstances might react very differently to that. If I were thoroughly thrashed as a child, my reaction to that could very well be different from Aditya Verma's reaction to it. How it interacts, how that fact of beating interacts with my psychology and my psychosocial circumstances is a highly individualized experience, right? And therefore, this again connecting it back to this idea of individualized sentencing, right? That's why it becomes so important, right? One of our most tragic cases, when tragic in many ways, right, is a case we lost before. Okay, let me not say anything sarcastic, right? Is a case we lost before 3 judges, right? We were brought into the case at the review stage, right? So the Supreme Court had already held this person guilty, right? And sentenced him to death. And we were in review and we were brought in at the second hearing of the review, and there was only one more hearing after that, right? Okay, I just want to give a warning. It's a brutal case, so I'm just going to explain the facts. So I just want to let those of you who might be affected by it just know that I'm going to discuss it, right? So this person was about, I think at that time about 35 or 37, is sentenced to death for rape and murder of a child less than 2 years. Attempted to rape the child, and when he found that it was the child started crying, and he was and he went into that phase, and when he figured that that he couldn't go ahead with that act of raping the child, he takes a boulder and smashes it on the face of the child, right? That's the case, right? That's the case, right? Now, if you read the trial court, high court, Supreme Court judgments, right, you can imagine what they have done, and they have said, oh, this is a demon, this is not a human being, you know, how can they do that? And sure, I get it. I get it as human beings, even as I narrate these facts, it is revolting, right? It is difficult. And I don't want to say that, oh, it's not, and you know, people like us who do these cases are not affected by it. It is difficult, but that's not the job of a judge. The job of the judge is saying that, yes, here is what the case says. Where are the mitigating circumstances? Where is the mitigating investigation into this person's life? Yes, I might think that this is absolutely abhorrent. This is the worst, all of that, right? Anyway, they didn't give us time to do this kind of detailed mitigation investigation, and prisons in our country, depending on which state you're going and which prison you're going, very often my colleagues get only 20 minutes a week, right? 20 minutes a week. And so imagine how difficult it is going from Delhi to some district in some state, right? The expense there, and how many visits it must take to build that confidence in that person. Meeting the family, getting the family to talk to you, getting them to realize that it is perhaps the worst part of their lives that is most helpful to the case. That is the most difficult part. Everybody wants to present, हाँ मम्मी पापा तो ठीक थे, अच्छा था, खुश थे, हम सब खुश थे, कुछ खराब नहीं था, चलता था, ठीक था. That for mitigation investigation is the worst loop to get into, right? Now, in this case, what happened was he lost the review, right? Then we had to submit the mercy petition. For that, over 60 hours of interviewing, right? What we figured out was what no court had considered. What no court had considered up until that time, right? That this person, right from his childhood, had clearly severe mental illnesses, right? Was sent to all these babas and ashrams. So the court, even if he had taken it to court, the court would have said, oh, where is the doctor's documentation? I mean, and that's what I'm saying. The law has to be seen in its social context. In our social context, a person like that is sent to some Baba or some ashram. You can't ask me to produce documentation, right? We have to find other ways, right? Not that anybody was asking because we were not in court. And very strong suggestions of how he was abused in these ashrams, how his own father abused him, how they got him married off, how even after he got married off, his father would still beat him in front of his wife, right? And all this history, and again, this is not being presented to you as saying, oh, this is justification for what he did. But surely a court that is considering the blameworthiness and responsibleness or how responsible this person is needs to at least consider this. I'm not saying they should come out with, I'm not trying here to dictate the outcome, right? But how can a court, if you are so invested in taking someone's life, you must also be invested equally in the process that has to be followed to take that life, right? Now, that leads me to evidentiary standards, right? The prosecution has to make the case that this is a death sentence worthy case, right? And one of the things that it has to show is that I cannot be reformed, right? The alternate option of life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed. You can't answer that question by saying that somebody who rapes and murders a 5-year-old is incapable of reform. The question of reformation is necessarily a forward-looking one. It can't be a backward-looking one, right? If I am to be, can I be reformed, assumes that I have done something terrible that you need to ask that question of me. You can't answer the question of my capability to be reformed or the probability of my reformation by referencing back to what I did and say that, oh, if this guy has raped and murdered a 5-year-old, he's obviously not capable of reformation. That just misunderstands what Bachan Singh requires. That just misunderstands the requirement of reformation. It does lead to a very difficult philosophical question, though, right? That if you are fixing responsibility for what I did on, let's say, 10th of June 2015, how is it relevant if you're fixing responsibility for that how is it relevant what I did in prison after 10th of June 2015? I mean, of course, people like us often make the argument that you have to take into account jail conduct. What are they doing in jail? What kind of people are they? What kind of activities are they doing? How are they with others? All of that, we obviously, but I'm acknowledging the difficult philosophical question on responsibility and blameworthiness. I am being tried and being sought to be punished for something I did at a certain point in time, right? That is the question of responsibility. Then we need to have a first principles answer also to why what I do in prison after that is still relevant, right? And that might have to do with how we construct the idea of reformation, right? Now, in terms of remedying errors, I just want to raise a constitutional point that very often when it's pointed out to judges that sentencing has not happened properly. The response of the Supreme Court is great. We will do it here. Right? We will do sentencing here. Unlike so many other judgments now, they say, why are you coming to us? Go to High Court. Right? Here they're like, right? We will do it. Despite acknowledging that there is an error. And the most prominent example of this is the Delhi gang rape case. In the Delhi gang rape case, the Supreme Court acknowledged that sentencing had not been done properly by the trial court and the High Court and asked their lawyers to go and get whatever mitigating circumstances. And that's another story about their lawyers and what kind of representation they got. That's a whole different story, right? But the Supreme Court said, yes, we acknowledge that there was an error, but now we will only do it. Now, what is the constitutional problem here? The constitutional problem is if it had been done properly in the trial court, it would have been heard properly thrice in the trial court, High Court, and the Supreme Court. But with the Supreme Court saying that we will only do it properly for the first time, here, where do I appeal to? I can't appeal that further, right? Yes, I can go and review for sure. But by taking this legal position, what you have effectively done is you have denied me, right, of the chances of appeal that I would have had. And therefore, this whole question of how do you remedy sentencing errors is a big problem, right? You can't remedy it by saying, yes, we will do it here for the first time, properly here. Now, we're not going to do it elsewhere, right? So that's, again, a problem that Bachan Singh doesn't speak to, of what happens if sentencing is not done properly, right? What happens if mitigating circumstances are not brought forth, right? What happens if mitigating circumstances are not adequately considered? Now, all of that is the problem with Bachan Singh, and you see different courts adopting different strategies to address these issues, right? Now the next point is this gap of what did it mean when it said you have to ensure that the alternative option of life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed, right? And I think Machi Singh does great disservice to that, and I think it is high time that Machi Singh's inconsistency with Bachan Singh be tested, right? Machi Singh turns it on its head and says, while Bachan Singh says you have to say why life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed, Machi Singh turns it into the question on inadequacy of life imprisonment. Why would you say that life imprisonment is inadequate in this case? Look at it. Those are two very different questions to ask. On one, your burden is to say that life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed. You have to give a justification as to why life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed. That's your burden under Bachan Singh. But in Machi Singh, you turn it around to make it completely crime centric and say, why might life imprisonment be inadequate in this case? There opens the door for a very crime centric sentencing framework in India, where all then justifications are about the brutality of the crime. Oh, because the crime is so brutal, how can life imprisonment be adequate? It is inadequate. No judgment, no judgment ever goes into anyone that confirms the death sentence actually says, why is life imprisonment unquestionably foreclosed? That is such a high burden. The burden in trying to prove or establish or argue that life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed is such a high burden. And you significantly lower that burden by saying that what you need to show that life imprisonment is inadequate. That is a far easier burden for the prosecution, right? Than to show that life imprisonment is unquestionably foreclosed, right? Uh, I see we are coming up to the hour, and I'm just going to quickly go through the argument in the second paper and it is very much connected to these in terms of what sentencing factors are you using? What is so wrong in saying that in order to establish deterrence, I need to give you death, right? That if that it is for purposes of deterrence that I need to give you death, right? And the argument very often is that deterrence is acknowledged as a relevant phenological factor in Bachchan Singh, right? And the point that we've made in the paper is very simply this, that deterrence or retributive justice or whatever is a relevant consideration while thinking about the constitutionality of the death penalty. But it is a very problematic usage to consider it as a sentencing factor in an individual case. To tell me that I will be given death to achieve deterrence. When I frame it like that, there is deep philosophical disagreement on why you shouldn't do that. Why I cannot be an instrument for sending a message to somebody else. You are not punishing me for what I did then. You are using me as an instrument to send a message to others. It is denying me my personhood. You are then just treating me as an object to send a message to somebody else. Therefore, it is very problematic to say that, oh, to achieve deterrence, to keep society's confidence in law. If we didn't give you death, society would lose confidence in law or would lose confidence in our legal system, is starting to use penological factors as a sentencing factor, as an individualized sentencing factor. There is nothing individualized about that. There is nothing individualized about saying that to achieve deterrence, I will give you death. That giving death might achieve deterrence has been decided as a constitutionality issue. You can't drag it in now and say in individual cases, I will use deterrence as an individual sentencing factor. Yes, if you do give me death, one of the I don't know. I would argue against that deterrence is ever achieved, but anyway, even assuming that deterrence is achieved, as a sentencing judge, you cannot be taking deterrence as an individualized sentencing factor. It is just using me as some instrument, right? And yeah, Kant and all these people you can read on why this is so problematic, right? Right. And therefore, using this sentencing, using penological factors as sentencing factors has also allowed you to be more crime centric, right? It allows that further oh, there is so much crime in society. We cannot let people like this. What will happen to security, social order, all of those kind of things. You bring it in through this conversation on penological justifications, which are being used continuously as sentencing factors, right? So, in that sense, uh, the use of penological justifications has allowed a further crime-centric view on on sentencing in death penalty, right? Uh, Public opinion is another big factor that Machi Singh introduces, right? And I guess many of you are familiar with that critique of collective conscience. Again, similar philosophical foundations to its critique as to why you cannot use collective conscience, right? Which collective, right? Whose conscience? Why should I, to satisfy the collective conscience, why should you do it through my blood? Right, is the question, right? So therefore there are these deep questions in that sense, I would say, that uh, affect death penalty sentencing. And I think the larger framing of that, all of these points that are made, is that we really haven't extended fair trial standards or fair trial rights to sentencing. We really haven't explored what does it mean to have fair trial rights during sentencing, right? While we have done a fair bit of that theorizing and understanding during the conviction stage, we really haven't teased out what does it mean to have fair trial rights during sentencing. What is the content of the right? What is the content of the fair trial right? When you say I have fair trial rights during sentencing, what does it mean? And I think the content of that is, I think, significantly different because of all these factors that I was talking about, right? Is the content of the fair trial right during the sentencing phase, I would argue, and again that's for another time, is very different from fair trial rights during the conviction stage. And unless we develop that framework, we really are not going to be able to solve all of these problems that I just discussed. And I'll stop with that at 7 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anup. So it was a wonderful discussion in the sense that you introduced so much of philosophical complexity that is involved in capital sentencing jurisprudence. Also, one important uh, point that you've raised in your one of the papers, it's enduring gaps and errors in capital sentencing in India, where you differentiated between the word weightage and the word balancing.
Yeah.
So I personally found it very interesting. So would you please like to comment on that?
Yeah. No, I think balancing is that it is one against other, right? You can balance one thing away in light of the other. Whereas in weighing, you have to give value and substance to each factor. You have to give it its, you have to, in that sense, discuss the role of each factor. Whereas in balancing, you know what the courts do, young age can be balanced away against the rape and murder or a brutal rape and murder of a 2-year-old, right? It is putting one against each other in balancing, whereas in weighing, what is required of you is that you have to give it adequate consideration, which balancing does not require you to do, right? Balancing only requires you say, yeah, is how does age fit into the balance against this? It does not tell me, or it does not require me to further make the argument of why is age relevant to this person, right? What is it about this person's age that is relevant to this case? It balancing only gives you a pro forma approach to sentencing. Yes, age, no. Age against brutality of crime is not acceptable. It does not lend substance to the sentencing factor, which weightage viewing it as weightage forces you to do.
Right, right. So now we've moved to the Q&A, question and answer session, and we have many raised hands. So we'll start with Sunandini. I saw her hand raised first. So
Yeah.
Sunandini, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you, Dr. Surendranathan. It was
Yeah.
a great talk and quite intriguing. I have a bunch of questions. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm the first year PhD scholar at Dharmashastra National Law University.
Oh.
So I have quick questions for you. First is the case which you discussed in your talk. I want to ask that what was the ground of taking up that case in the court for the appeal, for review
Which case? The review one.
Yeah, the review and then for mercy petition, which you lost.
We haven't lost the mercy petition yet.
Okay.
Yeah, we lost the
Okay.
review. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in that way case, first thing I would like to ask is how do you pick up these cases that which you go for appeal? Second thing is that you told that this person was suffering from severe mental health issues, and he used to go to various babas and all that. So in courts where everything is black and white, how do we establish if we don't have any evidentiary value with that regard? If we don't have any paper or doctor proof or any documentary proof, how do we establish that? Another thing which is like continuously coming into my mind is that we are continuously talking about justice for the accused. How do we balance it with the justice with regard to victims? Because okay, that everything has to be balanced out, but when it comes to victims, how do we balance it out in terms of accused and victim? Another point which you raised is in Nirbhaya case, in the remedy sentencing errors, there were sentencing errors. Supreme Court itself pointed out. How far it is justified that the case is sent back to trial court, and with so much of languishing cases and already, courts taking up so much time when the case reaches the Supreme Court, how far that is viable that we send the entire case to trial court in the first instance, and then again that entire process starts again. And last question is that if not deterrent or retributive justice, then what do you suggest? What is going to be the remedy for it? So that's all what I want to ask.
Okay. I want to quickly try and answer these 6 questions. Right. Thank you, Sunandini, for that. All very relevant and challenging questions. Right. What was the ground for the review in the Supreme Court? Yes, obviously you have to show error on the face of the record, right? And our argument was that this person's lawyer was not present during sentencing, which is anyway evident through the documents in the case, that this person's lawyer was just not present during some of the sentencing hearings, and we were saying that the Supreme Court's appreciation of sentencing was incorrect on the face of the record, and that sentencing information was not brought forth, and therefore the review must be heard, right? And anyway, now since it is a matter of right, they have to hear it in open court, right? And so therefore we took that ground that sentencing needs to be considered, and we asked for more time to say we need to go and meet this guy, spend time with him, get all the stories out, and they said no, too bad. This is it, right? And we argued and had very little information at that point. How do you pick up cases? We don't. They come to us, right? Is a long and short story of this. We have a certain reputation in many prisons now, a good one, I might add, because we do invest quite a bit of time, effort, and resources in writing to them regularly, in going and meeting them, even if there is no updates on their cases. We ensure that we meet them at least thrice a year. We regularly write to them every month, even if there's nothing to update them on, even if it's just to send them short stories or poems, or we encourage them to write to us so that they start talking about themselves, right? And it gives them a sense of, very often these are people who have lost all hope. So therefore, you keep talking to them, you keep writing to them, since you can't keep going and meeting them every week or every month, right? That kind of letter writing. So it builds a certain. So when new cases come into the prison of death sentences, the existing prisoners say, "Oh, why don't you write to these guys?" Right? And so it's like a self-referral mechanism, right? But our first bunch of cases came because of the report that we did. While we were doing the research, we did indicate that we would not be able to help them in their cases. But once the report was done, we did start taking up cases, because just the research ethic of it, that we can't say, "Oh, you give us your research interview and we will offer you legal representation." So at that point, we said no legal representation, and later we started, and that's how things have built up over time. Yeah, and we are more. We are quite well known in your state. Yeah. We have quite a few cases from Madhya Pradesh. Right. Uh, how do I establish that? Yes, that's Sunandi. That's a very tough question, right? If I were to establish by rules of evidence, right? Can I establish this beyond reasonable doubt that he had a mental illness? Probably not, right? The past mental illness is what I'm saying. But I think the courts have, some judgments have adopted a sort of sensible logic to it and say, you give it an affidavit, right? You give it an affidavit. If the prosecution wants to contest it, let them contest it. They are the ones that want to take life. If they are the one that wants to take the life of the person, you give it an affidavit, right? If they want to contest it, let them do the work of contesting it, right? And then we'll see, right? Now, another point in this is, now if I want to have a mental health evaluation done of my client, the law currently is that the principle of equality of arms is not applicable. The court will either say, "Oh, let's have a government psychiatrist do this." Why should? I mean, that's again a complex question in our system. That the court appoints a board, which are primarily of government employees, right? I might raise a question that me, as challenging my conviction and my sentence against the state, I want to take in my own mental health experts. That's the equality of arms, right? That's the equality of arms. Why should a state mental health professional ask me to do it? But in our system, you could raise the argument that having a board do it is better, because on the one hand, you are saying people cannot afford good lawyers, they cannot afford good resources. And yes, some prisoners might have Project 39A and NLU Delhi behind them, but not everybody is going to have that, right? So you may as well have a system where the court is ensuring that there is some evaluation. And here you are arguing that you want your own mental health professional. I mean, in our cases, I would certainly want our own mental health professional, because the politics of that discipline, of how you think about mental illness, how you think about intellectual disability, is also a very contested space, right? It is, just because it's science doesn't mean it is not contested, right? So even there, I would say that, yeah, so in that sense, your own experts is one answer to your question. Otherwise, affidavits, and the state, if it has a problem with that affidavit, it's for the state to say why and what it disagrees with, right? And then we'll see, right? If them come up with why they think that we are lying, or why the prisoners' lawyers are not accurately representing, or whatever, right? Justice for the accused. What is the balance with victims' rights, Sunandini? I mean, I would only say this, right? Is it difficult for a poor person to go and file an FIR that she has been sexually assaulted, and get that as a fair investigation, get a timely investigation, get a proper investigation? We are seeing the pathetic rate of conviction. Is that a problem? Absolutely, right? Absolutely. I'm not for a moment going to deny that. But on the other hand, is torture a problem, right? Is fabrication of evidence a problem? Is wrongful conviction a problem? Are most of our convictions filled with torture-based evidence? Absolutely, right? Both of these are problems, Sunandini, and I don't think you can. And both of them require their own solutions. I don't think you're going to solve the victims' rights problem by taking away more and more of the accused rights. So I'm not denying, I'm of course I agree that there are problems on the victim side of things. Sure. But the solution to that, I think it's convenient for politicians and judges to sell it to us that the solution to that is to take away rights of the accused. Right? It just doesn't work like that, right? And for me, both we have to imagine both if I suffer a crime or if I commit a crime. Both are instances of state failure. The state has failed Nirbhaya as much as the state has failed those 4 people it hanged. The state failure is both for victims of crimes and perpetrators of crime. The state has failed both of them. Right? The state can't wash its hands off and say, oh, I didn't fail the perpetrator. Of course, the state failed the perpetrator. Society failed the perpetrator. Just as society failed the victim, right? And that might give you an insight of where the actual philosophical opposition to the death penalty might come at a later conversation. But its roots lie there, right? After we peel away all the layers, it comes down to who is responsible for what. And I don't think state and society can really wash its hands off for commission of crime, right? The state cannot so conveniently just slip into the shoes of the victim and say, I will fight for you. No, sorry, it doesn't work like that, right? You can't understand the state's political obligations in that manner, right? You said, what about Nirbhaya? Should we have sent it back to the trial court? What about I guess anyway, it would have. I mean, we could argue whether it could have been sent back for just for sentencing or not. But my point is that, if you are so keen to take life, the job of the Constitution is not to make your life easier, is not to make your task easier. The job of the Constitution is to make your task as difficult as possible to take life. And that should be the interpretation of the courts. Right? Which way should we go on many of these questions? You should go the way that makes it difficult to take life, not the way where it is easier to take life.
But sir, in all these cases, till the time the accused is sentenced for a death penalty, it already takes. Don't you think it takes a lot of time to reach to that level? Because after multiple appeals reaching to Supreme Court level, it
Sure.
already takes a lot of time and a lot of difficulty to reach to that level.
Sure, and precisely, Sunani, that's the conversation when you have now introduced the death penalty into POCSO, right? For non-homicide offenses, right? People like me are going to drag out POCSO cases, right? Right? And you can't blame people for wanting to fight for the right to live, right? Right? Now, and I say that because the whole idea behind POCSO was that children as victims should not be made to suffer, right? Just the prolonged nature of the criminal process is very demanding and taxing, right? And it's traumatic for children. Now, you just lose sight of that completely, right? It was meant to be a child-friendly legislation. And now you lose complete sight of that in the politics and say, I will introduce the death penalty. Now, I can tell you there are challenges now waiting to happen. Now you introduce the death penalty. Now you have sections 29 and 30 in the POCSO, which is reverse burden of proof and legal fiction of the mens rea. I'm like, you can't do that as long as, if you want to give the death penalty, you can't have a reverse burden of proof leading to a death penalty. So, we get so consumed in the immediate politics of retribution, right? We lose sight of the broader questions that why did we even have this act, right? So So in that sense, does it go on? Does it drag on? Of course. Is it made to drag on? Absolutely, it's made to drag on, right? Because today you're saying, okay, a judgment comes in review, right? Supreme Court upholds a death sentence. I will not immediately file the review, right? There might be some cases where I might. There are some cases, most cases where I won't, right? You will file the mercy petition, hoping that by the time the mercy petition is decided, the bench has changed and the judges who decided the criminal appeal are no longer in the Supreme Court. Thank God our appointments process, right? That by the time the mercy gets decided, the judges who decided the criminal appeal are no longer in court, and you have a chance of going before another bench and getting the death sentence commuted. So many cases that we were saddled with, where we had taken on at the review stage, were argued before benches that were not the criminal appeal benches, and they all got commuted. Right? So yes, is there? Am I being cynical by playing for time? You're absolutely right. I am playing for time, right? Because playing for time means a better chance to live, right? Why not, right? And yeah, so therefore, if you want speedy justice, right? Let's not. It's not about 3-day trials and 5-day trials. And in your state, right? In your state, you have the ridiculous policy that prosecutors are rewarded, are given points if you get more points if you get a death sentence.
Right. Absolutely.
What happened to prosecutorial independence, right? I mean, I don't know who advises these guys on all these things. I mean, really. Yeah. So then you said, if not retributive or deterrence, what else? So Sunati, I'm not saying that retribution or deterrence cannot be valid penological goals of a criminal justice system. They can be if they want to be, whatever. That's a larger democratic political conversation. We can have whatever penological goals. But my only disagreement was that they can't be individualized sentencing factors. That's all, right? I'm not saying anything else. I'm not doubting, at least at this stage, I'm not doubting whether they are legitimate goals for a system to have. Yes, a system might well have those goals, but can they be used as factors in individualized sentencing exercises? Perhaps no, is my answer. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. So on the second last point that you made, I recall a webinar on positivism and international law day before yesterday happened, where one of the contemporary thinkers said that it is only the barbaric legal systems who are retentionist, who still have death penalty, who still have not abolished it. So I recall that. And the point that how prosecutions are given awarded points, rewarded rather, for death sentence or for number of convictions actually has a very important bearing. I don't know whether it can be empirically calculated or not, on how we are developing a system of prosecution, a system of sentencing, and maybe subconsciously, but how we are doing. That's quite fascinating, a study. Okay, so we have many raised hands. I would
I
take the
just
question
take,
from Palak.
I can just take 3-4 questions together. Also, Swati, I'm so sorry. I
Right.
have to leave at 7:30. So I'm so sorry. But let's take 3 or 4 questions more. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll be taking 3 questions. So one is Palak, who is a student of MSW from TIS Mumbai. So Palak, can we have your question, please?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Palak.
Yes.
Go ahead.
All right. First of all, I'm going to give a disclaimer that I'm not a law student. I'm a mental health social worker. So pardon me for if not using the correct technological terms. I have 2 questions, very simple questions.
Yes.
The first one is, again, coming from a philosophical idea that Sir said that you should, if you're going for sentencing, you should follow the due process in terms of mitigating factors and all of that. The undertone that I got from it was that we are a very morality heavy society, and for example, if there is a person who has a biological predisposition to do a crime, And so, like, I think he was trying to go for divorcing morality from assessing the circumstances within which you sentence a person, and it's a very convoluted thing. And I think he didn't even explicitly say it, but I think he's trying to get. I mean, he was actually hinting at morality and divorcing it from it. So I would just want him to maybe talk about it a little more. The other question that I had was, I was reading this book by an investigative journalist where most of after the sentencing, when people send their mercy petitions and it takes like 2 to 3 years, those are death sentences are commuted because the reason being that you cannot subject somebody to that psychological torture of whether I will get to live or not. And based on that, a lot of the death sentences are commuted. And there's also a case where a person's death sentence was commuted because he was suicidal. He had suicidal ideations, and there was like a medical professional who did an assessment. So are these, I mean, they're not like clear-cut routes you take to commute a death sentence, but are these options that you also look for when you are trying to sort of commute a death sentence? These are two questions that I have.
Yeah. Thanks, Palak. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. I think very interesting couple of questions there. Okay, Aditya, can we have the question from you? Aditya Verma, you've raised your hand.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Firstly, I would like to congratulate in just a quick note that it is a wonderful work, sir, that you are doing. It's a very brave piece of writing, plus the groundwork that you are doing. And it's just hats off to you and your team. But the question that I have for you, I had many, but I have drafted just one. That you said that we want to reform, we want a reformation. Basically, we were discussing some reformations. And my point is that having discussed that brutal and gruesome case, from a legal point of view and from a layman's point of view as well, my very naive thought is that is everyone actually deserving for a reformation chance? Reason being, there are some people who, like I have already established in my previous statements, that who do these things just for fun because of their mental illness or whatever. But even if they are not mentally ill, there are people who takes pleasure in doing certain things. And that is where, and if everyone is deserving for the reformation, then where do we draw the line? Where does the law draw a line where we say that, okay, how do we approach this? So that is it, and thank you so much for conducting this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Aditya, for your question. Aditya Tripathi, can we have your question quickly?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. First of all, thank you, sir, for this talk. It's been very enriching. Plus, in my third year, I also applied for an internship, so that was not selected. So I would like to quote that.
I'm sorry.
Plus, sir, I would just add to Palak sir's question and just try to reframe that. That if is in case a person, because of certain mental state of mind or because of his upbringing, has done that crime, but over the course, let's see, we take it a step forward, we send him for the reformation, and he is again pushed into the society, and it's very just that the society won't take him, and he again comes into the same mental space. So what would happen then? And he does that crime, commits that crime again. So that would be a bit but how would we taking forward that? And also, sir, there have been many investigative series. I have been very intrigued by the work. Also, because the line you said that society felicitates the perpetrator, that has been, I guess, that the same line has been said in Mindhunter, that is a TV series, Netflix series. So I would say that if when this crime was committed, and I was the one that was there at that point of time, and I have been for say killed by that person. So at that very moment, I guess this question might have been asked you a lot of time. At that very point, my rights have also been hindered, and I don't have any rights from per se further after that. So ain't that a problem as well?
Yeah.
That's also. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Aditya. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly go through these questions. An eye on the clock. Palak, your question on. Could you just tell me what you meant by whether I was trying to divorce morality from it? I just didn't catch. I didn't quite get clarity on that part. What did you mean by that?
Sir, there have been cases of a lot of public jubilation at killing, people who have committed, say, a rape.
Yeah.
And in Hyderabad, the rapist,
Correct.
or
Yeah.
Vikas Dubey, and we don't consider due process. Then we're like, they deserved it, and let's get it done
Yeah.
with. And it's
Yeah.
the underlying assumption is because there is a moral sort of
Justification.
yeah. So that's what I'm asking.
It's
Like,
the right thing. Ultimate, just naturally the right thing to do. Yeah, I got it. Got it. Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, I am actually. I am actually. I'm advocating for a certain. Am I divorcing morality completely? I would say no. I'm advocating for a certain morality that has been articulated through the law and the constitution. Yes, that's what I'm articulating for, right? I'm not articulating a complete divorcing of morality. There is a certain choice that has been made and reflected, and I'm asking that we decide cases as per the law that has been laid down rather than extraneous considerations of what is just. You heard this argument of, in the Hyderabad context, it was good, it was celebrated, otherwise it would have taken so long, right? All of that. And I think that is taking us along the path of being a barbaric society, and it is not the direction in which we must be going. So I assume there is a certain kind of moral choice, and I think I'm dabbling within that set of moral choices is what I would think I'm doing. But certainly, I'm advocating against a morality of the mob, right? Certainly, I'm advocating against that. Um, Delay and mercy petitions, are those routes used? Absolutely. Those routes are used. It raises ethical conundrums. Uh, you know, People suffer very, very much not knowing what is happening to their case. They keep writing to us, especially people who are at the mercy petition stage. What is happening? What is happening? What is happening? Right? And we will not even file a single RTI to find out what is happening. Right? We know the person is suffering. Uh, you know, um, but the moment you file an RTI, you risk waking a sleeping dog, right? And then the system will move, right? And then you will get a mercy rejection. And you're obviously playing that cruel game where you're telling the person on the other side, it's in your interest to wait and suffer uh, and accumulate this delay, because then the unexplained delay is a constitutional ground for commutation, right? So you're playing that waiting game, right? And it's horrible. It's not easy, right? It's not easy telling your client to do that. Worse is when mercy petitions have been rejected after 10 years, 12 years, which is a short case of a commutation, or you think it is, right? You're never sure. And because you're never sure, you never move for that commutation yourself. You wait for the state to get moving. Unless the state moves the case, you don't move the case, right? And that's horrible. I mean, we very often really struggle with that, right? This person his mercy petition has been rejected after 10-year delay. Any reasonable judge should, and the law almost ensures you of a commutation, but you still don't want to risk going to court on your own initiative because you want the state to move first. Because you're like, if I move unnecessarily, unnecessarily itself is such a difficult word to use in this context, right? If I move and I land up before a terrible bench, what then? Right? So yes, delay is used, but there are complexities around that. Aditya Varma asked, reformation, is everyone deserving of reformation? What if people are doing it for fun? What if people, what is the, what about the classic criminally minded? Whatever, I know what that means. I don't know. I wonder if you're talking of personality disorders. I don't know if this is what you're heading for, right? whether personality disorders. We have the youngest participant on screen now. Yeah. uh, so yeah. No, I don't. I mean, am I saying everybody should be given a chance at reformation? Absolutely, right, without doubt. And the law has and the prosecution has to show that this person is not capable of reformation, right? The law has to show that. It has to show that for everybody. How do you establish that somebody is just doing it for the heck of it or enjoys committing crimes? Are all very contested questions, Aditya. There is, if the state were to tell me that your client enjoys it, I can think of, if I were given access to proper mental health experts, right, my response to that would come from multiple directions, right? And that really depends on the assessment of that individual, the psychosocial assessment of that individual, how you contest what the state is putting forth. Sure, if you're asking, is there a category of people who enjoy it? But the point is, but Aditya, I would ask you to ask the question that they enjoy it, even if you were to frame it like that. Why is a question to ask? How much of it are they themselves in control of? Right? How much of it are they in themselves in control of, or are you punishing them for something that they are not absolutely in control of? The question of free will, right? That they had a choice to go this way or the other way, and they went one way, right? Are all very contested concepts, even with people with personality disorders, right? How do you assess that, right? How do you come to that conclusion? Whether this person, that it was just pure will, pure free will, is something that would be very difficult to establish, Aditya, in the sort of pure form that you are asking the question. It would, yeah, it would be very difficult to
Sir,
establish.
it is just also the point that the defense of insanity is also a concept for the very
Yeah, I'm not on insanity, right? And there is a paper coming out on insanity very soon. Please do read it, right?
no, sir.
Right. Sorry to be pitching my papers, right? No, but I'm not on insanity. I'm not on insanity or competence to stand trial, right? I'm on at the sentencing stage. How should you account for? How should you account for mental health considerations, right? And there, these questions of, and again, in the area of mental health, the kind of question that you're asking is quite contested, right? Whether did that person do it out of pure will? I don't. Yeah, it's so difficult to answer. Yes, right? Yeah. Sorry, I
That was
know.
the purpose of question. Thank you so
Yeah,
much, sir.
yeah,
That was.
yeah.
Thank you.
Aditya Tripathi, what happens if we release people and there is recidivism and they commit the crime again, right? So Aditya, I would say that again, in so many of these conversations, comes down to how do we view crime? Do we view crime as an individual failure, or do we view crime as a social phenomenon? And I'm more inclined to believe that crime is a social phenomenon where the individual interacts with economic, social, cultural, political factors, and that produces crime, right? It's not. It's not just. And that produces crime. It's not. It's not just the wiring gone wrong in one individual's head, right? That, as I said, right? So I think we should move towards a more structural understanding of crime rather than thinking that crime is committed because I chose to do a crime, or that some sort of that it's purely individual failure, right? And crime never can. I don't think crime can ever be understood as that. That it is some sort of exclusive, personal, individual domain, right? It is always influenced by so many things around it, right? And that is primarily the reason why I think the death penalty is philosophically wrong, right? Because taking life would suggest that society thinks or the state thinks that the individual alone, purely, with nothing else, that the individual is responsible, and that is never the case. Thank you.
Right. So thank you so much, Dr. Anup, for this rich capital sentencing jurisprudence that you have introduced to us all. And I think everyone would be tempted after today's talk to read more on death penalty, be it your project or be it the book by Gopal Krishna D. So there's a lot of jurisprudence lying.
I just want to make
even
one
beyond
more
what.
pitch. Sorry, Swati. I just want to make one more pitch before you conclude. We have a book coming out with HarperCollins, right, on the 4th of February. It's stories of 19 death row prisoners that we have worked with, written in a very simple and easy language. You might be surprised by how it's being written. So do consider reading it. Yeah, and let us know what you think of it, right? Yeah. Sorry, Swati. Sorry to have interrupted you.
Sure. So congratulations for the upcoming book, and thank you so much for this interesting debate. I think after reading more on death penalty, it's very hard to remain retentionist. So that's what I've personally observed after reading very less about death penalty. So thank you for accepting. Thank you for being kind enough to accept our invitation for interaction today. And thank you all the participants.
Yeah, thanks everyone for turning up and
Thank
staying
you.
for this long. Thanks. Good night. Bye. Bye.